on, he pulled her beneath the surface. The crocodile has her.
911. What is your emergency?
A crocodile! My neighbor's crocodile, it's in the pool. It just dragged her beneath the water.
Stay calm. Who is the victim?
Megan Lewis. Please, she hasn't come back up.
The words fall into static, the line breaking under the weight of panic. A human voice, desperate and trembling, fighting against the unimaginable truth. A young woman has vanished beneath the surface of her own pool, pulled down by the very creature she raised and trusted. This is not the echo of a wild riverbank or some distant swamp. This is a private backyard, where the manicured grass meets turquoise water, and where trust in an ancient predator has turned fatally naive. Her name was Megan Lewis, and she believed she had built a bond with her reptilian companion, one that could transcend instinct. For years, she swam beside him, photographed with him, even spoke of him as family. But on this day, the illusion shattered in seconds. It is a story as tragic as it is haunting, and it raises questions none of us can easily answer. Subscribe to Animal Shock Stories for more true accounts, and share your thoughts about this chilling event in the comments. Megan Lewis was 35 years old when the world began to notice her, not for the tragedy that would one day define her name, but for the strange kind of devotion that set her apart long before. She was a quiet figure in her suburban neighborhood, moving with the unassuming grace of someone who rarely sought attention, and yet her life carried a gravity that drew whispers at every corner. She had always been drawn to animals others avoided, strays with scars and wings bent at awkward angles, dogs that barked too much or cats too feral for most households. But the day she came across a scrawny, half-drowned hatchling on the edge of a Florida canal was the day her path veered irreversibly toward legend and doom. The tiny crocodile, barely longer than her forearm, lay trembling beneath the shadow of a culvert, its scales slick with mud, its eyes glazed with exhaustion. Most would have stepped away, fearful of even the smallest incarnation of ancient reptilian power, but Megan lifted it into her arms and whispered promises no one else could hear. From that moment, she committed herself to raising it, bottle-feeding it with a stubborn tenderness, offering warmth from lamps and blankets, and constructing an enclosure that slowly grew larger with every passing year. The neighbors would watch her from behind blinds or fences, their curiosity mixed with dread, as the creature in her care began to outgrow the gentle myth of a rescued pet. They admired her discipline, the hours she spent cleaning, feeding, studying, walking slowly along the pool's edge with a clipboard and quiet notes as though she were a scientist cataloging a specimen in the wild. But admiration is a complicated thing, often entwined with suspicion. Some whispered that she was courageous, perhaps even extraordinary, while others muttered that she was reckless, a woman who had mistaken devotion for control, compassion for safety. Children rode past her house on bicycles, daring each other to peek through the fence for a glimpse of the monstrous silhouette slipping into blue water, while parents pulled them away, muttering warnings about accidents waiting to happen. Megan ignored these shadows of judgment. To her, the crocodile was not a threat, but a companion, an echo of prehistory that had somehow chosen her. She named him Samson, a name spoken softly, like a vow, and told friends who questioned her that he was misunderstood, that his aggression could be tempered with consistency and patience, that love was not the sole domain of mammals. In her voice there was always that note of conviction, the same tone one hears in someone defending faith, and it made it difficult to argue. Still, behind the polite nods and the reluctant smiles, doubt never fully left the minds of those who lived nearby. They felt, in their bones, the inevitability of wildness resurfacing, the way a shadow eventually surfaces beneath still water. And though Megan could not see it, every step she took beside Samson carried her closer to the day when admiration would curdle into horror. In the beginning, when Samson was no longer a fragile hatchling but still small enough to fit across her lap, Megan's house became a sanctuary of improbable routines. She prepared meals of raw fish and chicken, slicing them carefully as though she were serving a child, her hands steady even when his teeth clicked inches from her skin. Neighbors would sometimes glimpse her crouched in the backyard, holding the food just out of reach to make him swim toward her, rewarding his patience with gentle praise, as though reinforcing a language only the two of them understood. At night, she would sit beside his enclosure, her legs drawn close, her voice low as she read from worn paperbacks or hummed lullabies left over from her own childhood. In her world, Samson was not a reptile but a dependent soul, one who needed her consistency to thrive. When the Florida heat swelled and the pool shimmered like a pane of glass, she dared to enter with him, slipping into the water as his narrow body cut through it beside her. Friends who visited stood transfixed, their eyes wide as they watched the silhouette of her pale arms, mirrored by the dark streak of his form beneath the surface, two shadows in the same water, fused by trust. "He knows me," Megan would insist, smiling as droplets clung to her hair. But concern flickered at the edges of every gathering. One friend, shifting uncomfortably, once told her, "Meg, one day instinct will win. You can't erase what he is." Megan only shook her head, her conviction as impenetrable as Samson's armored hide. She believed her devotion could outlast predatory impulse, that the years of feeding, stroking, and swimming together had woven a bond deeper than biology. And yet, beneath the lyrical stillness of those days, subtle warnings began to emerge. Samson's lunges grew sharper, his movements quicker, and his stillness heavier, the silence of calculation rather than calm. But Megan, blind to foreshadowing, interpreted these changes as challenges to be met, as stages in growth rather than hints of danger. Her hands bore faint scratches, her swims carried moments when the water rippled too violently, yet she smiled through them, clinging to the illusion of communion. To her, the crocodile was family, her child, her companion, her proof that love could tame even the most ancient of predators. To others, those same moments whispered of inevitability, a clock ticking toward the instant when devotion and instinct would collide. Megan's world slowly narrowed until it revolved almost entirely around Samson, the crocodile who had grown from fragile hatchling to towering presence, a living relic from a time before humanity even existed. Her mornings began not with the hum of conversation or the flicker of messages from friends, but with the heavy silence of water shifting as Samson stirred beneath the surface of his pool. She would kneel at the edge, clipboard in hand, documenting his feeding patterns, the texture of his skin as it shed, the shifting rhythm of his tail, as though she were cataloging a creature in a museum of prehistory. To her, Samson was more than an animal. He was a symbol of endurance, a survivor of countless extinctions, a fragment of something eternal that chose to exist in her presence. She often spoke of him in reverent tones, describing him as if he carried secrets in his armored hide, as if within his stillness lay the wisdom of rivers older than language itself. But while her bond deepened, her connections to people frayed. Friends who once visited regularly began to stop coming, unsettled by the scale of the reptile lurking just beyond the glassy surface of the pool. Invitations dwindled, holidays passed with fewer voices around her table, and soon, Megan found that Samson's company had filled every void others had left behind. She didn't seem to mind. She spoke less of loneliness and more of loyalty, telling herself that he was the one companion who would never betray her, who required nothing but care and presence. Yet from the outside, it looked like withdrawal, as if she had traded the warmth of human laughter for the unblinking stare of a predator older than civilization itself. On humid nights when the neighborhood lights flickered on and screens glowed inside homes, Megan could be found outside, sitting by the pool with Samson drifting like a dark continent beneath the surface. She whispered to him, her words dissolving into the heavy air, imagining that his silence was a kind of listening, a communion untouched by human frailty. In those moments, she looked less like a woman keeping a pet and more like a priestess guarding an ancient god, her devotion total, her sacrifices invisible. The neighbors saw shadows moving across her yard and shook their heads, uncertain whether to admire her discipline or pity her solitude. For Megan, however, the choice had already been made. Her life had braided itself into the presence of the crocodile, and there was no untangling. Each day was a ritual, each night a vigil, and Samson had ceased to be simply an animal in her care. He was the axis around which her existence turned, a silent, scaled deity she believed she understood, but never truly could. With each passing year, Samson's body expanded, stretching into a hulking mass of armored scales and raw muscle that no one could ignore any longer, least of all the neighbors who now spoke in hushed tones about danger and legality. What had once been a curious oddity, a young woman nurturing a rescued hatchling, had become an unnerving spectacle. A 15-foot crocodile gliding beneath the turquoise shimmer of a suburban pool, jaws like stone gates, tail like a whip capable of shattering bone. Officials occasionally appeared at Megan's door, citing ordinances and safety codes, asking pointed questions about containment, liability, and the risk to the community. Each time, Megan's voice was unwavering, her eyes holding that stubborn conviction that had carried her since the day she pulled Samson from the canal. "I have control," she insisted, repeating it as if the words themselves were a protective charm against reality. She argued that Samson recognized her scent, her voice, her presence, that years of care had built trust no law could quantify. And though inspectors noted the reinforced fencing, the warning signs, and her careful routines, there was always something left unspoken, a sense that the true measure of risk could not be calculated on paper. The neighbors continued to watch from behind curtains, torn between fascination and fear, whispering of inevitability even as Megan waved politely and carried buckets of food to the pool. To her, Samson was no different than a loyal companion, predictable if respected, harmless if treated with love. But beneath her calm routines and recorded notes, an unspoken truth churned. Every ripple of water, every glint of his eyes, reminded those who glimpsed him that this was not a pet, but a storm trapped in glass. A storm was swelling beneath calm water, and though Megan convinced herself she could read its moods, she could not alter its nature. Samson grew not only in size but in force of presence, an ancient pressure pushing against the fragile boundary of human control. The pool enclosure became a place of duality. To Megan, it was sanctuary. To others, it was a ticking clock. And in that tension, between devotion and dread, the seeds of tragedy were already stirring. The first signs did not arrive as a single catastrophe, but as a series of moments so small that Megan almost convinced herself they were meaningless, fleeting ripples in the surface of her bond with Samson. One afternoon, as she leaned over the water with a slab of raw chicken dangling from her hand, the crocodile lunged with a force that startled even her steady nerves, his jaws snapping shut so close to her wrist that the sound cracked through the still air like a gunshot. She laughed it off, murmuring to him as if to soothe both their nerves. But that night her hands trembled faintly as she poured herself a glass of wine, and she found her mind replaying the sudden rush of teeth. Another time, he refused his food entirely, ignoring her calls and circling at the bottom of the pool with unsettling patience, his eyes fixed on her in a way she could not decipher. Days later, while she floated in the water beside him, he brushed against her body with the deliberate heaviness of a creature that knew its strength. She surfaced, chest heaving, trying to convince herself it was an accident, that he meant no harm. Her neighbors saw these shifts from afar, heard the occasional splash followed by her raised voice, and muttered warnings she chose not to heed. Friends who still bothered to call urged her to let Samson go, to donate him to a sanctuary where trained experts could manage his instincts. But Megan always dismissed them with a weary firmness. "He knows me," she repeated like a litany, the same phrase she had used since the beginning, as though repeating it might bend reality to her faith. Yet the unease began to accumulate in her silence, in the way her eyes lingered on the water before stepping in the pause she took before reaching her hand toward his gaping mouth. The dread was not loud, not obvious, but it coiled in the background of her days, a tightening thread pulling toward an unseen end. Each ignored warning echoed louder than the last, until the pattern was undeniable, though she refused to name it. The storm beneath the calm was no longer swelling, it was beginning to shift. The sun bore down with the heavy insistence of a Florida afternoon, the kind of heat that pressed into skin and made the air shimmer above concrete. Megan wiped her brow as she unlatched the gate to Samson's enclosure, her movements practiced, almost ritualistic, as though the day were no different from 100 that had come before. The water glowed a crystalline blue, serene and inviting, its surface smooth as glass and utterly deceptive in its calm. Samson floated near the far wall, his vast body motionless, eyes barely visible above the waterline, a relic of another age basking beneath suburban skies. Megan slipped off her sandals, placed them neatly beside the fence, and lowered herself into the pool with the quiet determination of someone stepping into a sacred space. For her, this was not danger but communion, an act that bound her to the creature she had nurtured for years. The neighbors noticed, as they always did, curtains parting, curious eyes peering toward the yard. Some whispered warnings to their children to stay away. Others simply shook their heads, resigned to the sight of the woman and her crocodile moving together in impossible harmony. To them, it had become background noise, a spectacle so familiar that its strangeness had dulled, though unease lingered like static in the summer air. Megan floated on her back, arms stretched wide, the sun painting her skin gold as Samson's shadow traced beneath her, their two forms aligned like parallel truths. To her, it was trust, devotion made visible. To anyone watching, it was a fragile illusion, a heartbeat of calm, masking the weight of ancient instinct lurking below. Megan let herself drift across the surface, her body buoyant in the shimmering afternoon light, every muscle slackened as though she had surrendered completely to the moment. The pool stretched around her like a mirror of glass, catching fragments of the sun and scattering them in shards across her skin, the ripples from her breath expanding outward in delicate rings that shimmered and then dissolved. Beneath her, Samson circled with the patience of something eternal, his vast shape moving like a continent slowly shifting beneath blue skies. His tail swept in languid arcs, sending tremors through the water that barely reached her fingertips. Yet each subtle current reminded her of the power coiled in his body, a power she believed she had tamed with nothing more than constancy and care. From above, the scene carried a strange beauty, a woman floating as if asleep, and beneath her, a shadow circling, predator and caretaker suspended in fragile harmony. The reflection of her face wavered on the surface, haloed by the sun, and across it drifted the darker outline of his ridged back, two images overlapping in a fleeting suggestion of unity. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It pulsed with an unspoken tension, like the pause between heartbeats, the stillness before thunder splits the sky. Megan exhaled slowly, eyes closed, trusting the water and the creature beneath it as she always had, her lips curling into the faintest smile, a prayer of gratitude whispered without words. To her, this was proof that devotion transcended fear, that the years of whispered promises, sleepless vigils, and ignored doubts had not been wasted. She believed that in his circling, Samson was not hunting but acknowledging her, that his gaze held not calculation but recognition. It was a symbolic moment, almost liturgical in its weight, a communion forged between human and reptile, predator and caretaker bound in silent understanding. And yet the air itself seemed to thicken, the light bending oddly across the water, the reflection wavering as if warning that harmony could never last forever. To anyone watching, the sight was mesmerizing, but beneath its fragile beauty lurked an unease that words could not soothe. The calm was not peace, it was suspension. A breath held too long, a storm crouched just beyond the horizon, waiting. The water, which had seemed so calm only moments before, began to tell a different story. Samson's movements grew sharper, no longer the slow, drifting arcs of a companion at rest, but sudden sweeps of his tail that cut the pool into violent ripples. His massive body curved beneath Megan with a new urgency, a tightening spiral that sent subtle waves rocking against her arms and legs. She floated on, eyes closed, unaware that the rhythm had changed, that what once felt like a dance was shifting into something else entirely. When she finally opened her eyes, she caught only a flicker of him, a ridged back slicing through the blue before disappearing again, his eyes two pale embers fixed unblinking on her silhouette above. There was an intensity in that gaze, a calculation that no devotion could erase, the raw mathematics of predator and prey reasserting itself after years of uneasy dormancy. The shadow beneath her thickened, expanding as Samson angled closer, the water darkening with his presence until it seemed the light itself recoiled. She breathed deeply, whispering words of reassurance to him, as though her voice could tame the current building under her body. To her, his circling was still a sign of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged. She did not see the tightening of his turns, the way his massive head angled upward, the faint tremor of anticipation coiling through muscle and scale. The moment hung suspended, deceptive in its quietness, as though time itself had slowed to savor the fragile boundary between trust and violence. But nature does not pause out of reverence. Megan's smile faltered as she noticed the turbulence around her legs, the way the water lifted against her ribs. Something in the pit of her stomach stirred, an unease she had learned to suppress. But even as instinct whispered danger, she chose denial, clinging to the illusion of control. She could not know that in this instant, the years of faith and defiance had reached their final threshold. The pool, once her sanctuary, now felt like an arena, the walls closing in as the storm long promised began to stir. And though she could not see it, the moment of no return had already arrived, buried beneath the rippling surface, waiting for its violent release. The rupture came without warning, a sudden violence that shattered the illusion of calm in an instant. One moment Megan drifted weightless beneath the sun, the next, the pool exploded upward as Samson erupted from below, a wall of muscle and scales breaking the surface with terrifying force. His jaws snapped shut around her torso with a sound like stone colliding, the impact stealing her breath before she could even scream. Water surged skyward in great plumes, crashing back down as her body was wrenched beneath the surface, her arms flailing once, twice, before vanishing into the vortex. The neighbors who had idly glanced through their curtains a moment earlier now shrieked in disbelief, their cries carrying across the still heat of the afternoon. The turquoise serenity of the pool convulsed into chaos, the surface torn open by Samson's thrashing tail, sending waves slamming against the concrete edges. For an instant, Megan's hand broke the water, fingers clawing desperately for air and sky, but the pull beneath was merciless. Red unfurled around her in clouds, a spreading stain that transformed the water into a violent canvas of life, ebbing away. Witnesses stumbled into the yard, their voices fractured with horror. "Call 911, somebody help her." But there was no rescuing her from the grip of an animal that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of the kill. The sounds of splashing and muffled struggle reverberated in sickening rhythm, each second stretching into eternity. The pool, a stage of primal brutality that erased years of tenderness in moments. Samson rolled, the infamous death spin of his kind, dragging her deeper, twisting her body with a force no human could resist. The violence was both chaotic and eerily precise, the mechanical execution of instinct unleashed at last. By the time the water began to still, the screams had given way to stunned silence. The only sound, the lapping of waves against the tiles and the faint gurgle of water reclaiming what had been disturbed. The surface glistened with broken sunlight again, but now it carried the crimson haze of finality. In the space of seconds, devotion had been obliterated, and the sanctuary Megan believed she had built became her grave. The wail of sirens fractured the heavy silence as police cruisers and ambulances barreled into the neighborhood, their flashing lights slicing through the humid dusk. Red and blue beams strobed against the rippling water, dancing across the broken surface, where only minutes before, Megan had floated in deceptive serenity. Neighbors clustered at the fence line, faces pale and hollow, their voices hushed now, as if afraid to disturb the grim reality solidifying before them. Paramedics rushed in with stretchers and equipment, their urgency muted by the knowledge that seconds had already stretched into eternity. The pool, once turquoise, was streaked with a murky stain, the water sluggish and disturbed, carrying faint traces of what had just transpired. Divers entered with ropes and poles, circling the predator that now lay eerily motionless near the far edge, his massive body half submerged, eyes unblinking. Samson did not thrash or resist. He simply floated in the shallows, his armored back gleaming under the strobes, as if indifferent to the chaos his instincts had unleashed. The contrast was haunting, the stillness of a creature that had returned to equilibrium while human hearts fractured in disbelief. When Megan's body was finally recovered, lifted carefully from the water, the lifeless weight of her form told a story no words could soften. Her hair clung dark and heavy against her face, her skin pale in the artificial glow, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman who had once spoken of devotion and trust. Officers stepped back, their eyes lowering, the air thick with reverence and disbelief, while neighbors wept softly, clutching each other as though to tether themselves to the moment. In the background, Samson remained unmoving, his silence more chilling than any display of aggression. He seemed less like an animal cornered, and more like an ancient presence that had simply resumed its natural state, indifferent to human grief, untouched by the weight of tragedy. The pool lights flickered across him, painting him in hues of red and blue, a living monument to the line Megan had tried so desperately to blur between love and instinct. The scene closed in somber stillness, the cries quieting, the sirens fading to a hum, leaving behind only the echo of loss and the eerie calm of a predator who had done nothing more than obey his nature. In the days that followed, the story of Megan Lewis spread far beyond her quiet neighborhood, carried by headlines and whispered in living rooms, each retelling tinged with disbelief. How could devotion so absolute end in violence so swift? To some, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the danger that comes from mistaking care for control, love for safety. To others, she was a tragic emblem of human longing, the desperate need to believe we can bridge the abyss between ourselves and the wild. Megan had spent years convincing herself that Samson was more than a predator, that patience and tenderness could smooth the edges of instinct carved over millions of years. But in the end, nature answered with finality, a reminder that no ritual of devotion can rewrite the laws of survival. The sanctuary she built was never truly hers. It belonged to something older, stronger, beyond sentiment. And so the question lingers, a shadow pressing on the conscience. When we bring the ancient predator into our sanctuary, are we saving it or surrendering ourselves? The image of Megan floating in still water and Samson's shadow thickening beneath her remains, etched in the mind, a haunting parable of trust misplaced. There is reverence in the tragedy, not for the violence, but for the truth it reveals, that we are always fragile in the presence of what we do not fully understand. The crocodile's indifference was not cruelty, only inevitability, and perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. Megan's name now echoes with a kind of solemn weight, her story a reminder of how thin the veil is between devotion and destruction. As the light fades on her tale, what remains is not resolution, but unease, a silence that asks us to reckon with the wildness we cannot tame, the shadows that swim beneath our illusions, waiting.